This is Health Matters, a podcast from Mayo Clinic where we discuss the latest medical advice, news, and research to help you live a happier and healthier life. My name is Kristen Meinzer. I'm a writer and journalist. And this episode, we're talking about foodborne illness, aka food poisoning. If your family is anything like mine, you've probably heard lots of conventional wisdom over the years about how eating XYZ will make you sick. Like, don't eat potato salad that's been sitting out in the sun, or don't eat cookie dough because it has raw eggs. Add to that, we're constantly hearing about recalls in the news. Carrots, cucumbers, onions, chicken. No matter how on top of things you are, there's a chance that a soon-to-be recalled product makes it into your fridge. With 1 in 6 Americans getting some form of foodborne illness each year, food poisoning is incredibly common. So, what can we do to keep our stomachs safe? That's where our guest, Dr. Christine Ragay-Cathers, comes in. She's a family physician at Mayo Clinic in Phoenix, Arizona. This episode, she's joining us to talk about whether we can rely on conventional wisdom, why there are so many recalls, and what to do when good food turns bad. Dr. Christine Ragay-Cathers, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
We are so thrilled to have you and your expertise. I don't know if it's just like psychologically I was planning for this, but I decided to eat food that I think was not good today because my stomach is like, I'm like, how long were those collard greens in the fridge before I ate them for lunch today?
I know. It's hard. And sometimes it can get pretty scary about foodborne illness and reading all the stuff that can go wrong when you eat.
Now, let's start off with the basics. Foodborne illness or food poisoning, it's kind of a catch-all term. When we say foodborne illness, what specifically in the food is making us sick, and how does it get into the food?
Generally, when we think about foodborne illness or food poisoning, we're referring to food that has been contaminated by pathogenic bacteria, viruses, or sometimes even parasites. And these microorganisms can then produce toxins in the food before it is consumed. And they can get into the food by improper food handling. So not washing your hands before handling food, not cooking food to safe temperatures, not refrigerating food when it needs to be refrigerated, not maintaining clean food preparation areas, and also not rinsing produce.
So you said that bacteria, viruses, even parasites can be present in food, and that can cause foodborne illnesses, but also just food being left out too long. Is that because the food is decomposing, or is that because the food has acquired a bacteria or a pathogen with age?
So there is bacteria on everything. There's bacteria on our skin. There's bacteria on every surface. There are certain bacteria that if food is, for instance, left out for too long, or if they're expired, or if they're not stored properly, those bacteria can produce toxins. And it's those toxins that are in the food that lead to that foodborne illness. So it has to be in a certain environment. And then you ingest the food with those toxins. That's when you become sick, like cooked rice. So a lot of times with rice, if you cool it right away and then store it, or if you consume it right away, then it's fine. But if the cooked rice is left out for, say, longer than 2 hours, especially at room temperature, there's a particular bacteria called Bacillus cereus that likes to grow in that cooked rice, and then it can form toxins. And then it can form spores that are actually heat resistant. Meaning, even though you reheat that rice later, it can still make you sick because those toxins have already been established in that rice.
So it's not that bacteria magically appears and starts doing stuff. It's that the bacteria was already there, but now it's getting to work making toxins, and that's what's hurting us.
Yes.
And if you suspect you might have a foodborne illness, how can you be sure it's from something you ate? Sometimes we'll say like, oh, that must have been from eating old leftovers, and that might be why my stomach is gurgling. But How do we really know for sure?
Symptoms typically occur within 1 to 3 days of ingesting the contaminated food or beverage. And some of this will depend on the type of microorganism involved, but generally within that time. And then the classic symptoms are nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, sometimes fever, sometimes blood and stool. Typically, when I have someone that presents with these symptoms, I'll ask if they can recall what they ate prior to the symptoms
Hmm.
occurring. And sometimes it's obvious, like they ate something that was out for a couple of hours, or they went to a street vendor. And sometimes it's not so obvious what that food might be. I'll also ask if there has been any recent travel out of the country, or if they went camping recently and may have ingested contaminated water from like a stream. Because if there is a known source of food that sounds like it could be related to that. So for instance, there are certain types of foods where you're more likely to develop a foodborne illness. And so if it seems pretty
Mm.
related, then it's more likely to be from that. But there are other studies that we could do to try to figure out if it is in fact related to a foodborne illness if needed.
What are some of those tests that you might conduct to help determine whether it's actually a foodborne illness that's hit me?
So we can do basic labs to check to see if you have an infection. We could also test your stool and also pinpoint the type of pathogen involved. And so that's more specific into determining the exact type of, say, bacteria or virus, or sometimes even parasite contributing to the foodborne illness.
Got it. Now, in general, how reliable are our senses in letting us know if food is bad or contaminated? Maybe we've done it ourselves where we go into the fridge, we open the container of milk, we sniff it, and we're like, that's good. Is my nose telling me the truth?
So, generally, our human instincts are reliable. We're built for survival, so our fight or flight response can be triggered. And sometimes it's an odor. So, you smell the food or the beverage and it can have a foul odor, or it smells stale or something's not right. Sometimes it's the color of the food. It might not appear as bright, or it looks a little funny to you. And then sometimes you might notice like an oily or a slimy residue over the food that might trigger your fight or flight response that you shouldn't eat that food or drink that beverage. And sometimes it's just the setting in which the food is in. If you notice the
Mhm.
food's been out for a long time and it's a hot summer day, for instance, outside, that kind of triggers that instinct that you shouldn't eat that food. So generally, our instincts are pretty reliable. And a lot of that has to do with our basic survival and fight or flight instinct.
So our nose often does know.
Yes.
That being said, sometimes it seems that one person might eat the same leftovers as another person and they'll be totally fine, but maybe some folks who eat them won't. Is it that some people are just more susceptible to foodborne illnesses?
Generally, you do have to think about where the person is, like health wise. Do they have a lower immune system due to some chronic
Mm,
condition? Or there are potential cultural and regional differences. For instance, with Asians, where rice being a big part of our diet. And I can certainly remember growing up, my mom would leave the would leave the rice out because of those cultural differences with food. There could be more tolerances to
mhm.
certain bacterias and things because of that.
So you're saying that it's possible to maybe even build up a slight resistance to certain foodborne illnesses?
I don't want to say like a resistance. I think that some individuals just may be more tolerant,
Mm,
potentially just based off of how they were brought up with that particular diet or in the region in which they live. There are certain kind of tolerances, probably more genetically related to that. And so I don't really want to say you can become over time if you eat that spoiled rice, for instance, over and over, that you might become resistant to it.
And doctor, is there a difference between, let's say, a slight exposure versus a larger exposure to a foodborne illness and how it will affect my body?
So, the most common symptoms of a foodborne illness are nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. And typically, the symptoms last for only a couple of days. So, it's self limited. And usually, the concern is dehydration. So, making sure you keep yourself well hydrated, drinking plenty of fluids. And a lot of this depends on the type of organism involved or bacteria involved. There are certain pathogenic bacteria where the symptoms are very mild and self limited. And there are others where the symptoms can be much more severe. And it's usually the dehydration from
Mm.
either vomiting or diarrhea that really can get someone in trouble. The vast majority of individuals that get foodborne illness, it resolves within a couple days. But unfortunately, there are a few where the symptoms can last much longer. And generally speaking, if the symptoms last like longer than a week, most definitely. And if you have significant abdominal pain or blood in your stool, or if you have a fever greater than like 102 degrees, then that could be something potentially more than a foodborne illness, or it could be a more severe foodborne illness. Usually, a simple foodborne illness, you generally won't have high fevers or blood in your stool. And if you do develop those symptoms, especially, then you should seek medical attention for further testing at that point.
So, in general, foodborne illness happens when a virus, bacteria, or parasite gets into your food and you consume it. Many run-of-the-mill foodborne illnesses come from bacteria that naturally live in food. The problem is when the food isn't properly handled, prepared, or stored in a way that allows those bacteria to start producing toxins that make us sick. Foodborne illness symptoms usually begin 1 to 3 days after consuming the contaminated food. And on the whole, people are pretty good at remembering the unusual thing they ate that likely triggered it. Typical symptoms are nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea that clear within a couple of days. But if symptoms last longer than that, or you're experiencing significant abdominal pain, a fever, or blood in your stool, definitely check in with your doctor. So now that we know how to diagnose foodborne illness, let's talk about common causes, foods and microorganisms to watch out for. Now, let's talk about recalls. You may recall that in the fall there was a big chicken recall. And if you check the FDA's recall list, it seems like there's new recalls popping up all the time. Carrots, cucumbers, onions, salad greens. How concerned should the average consumer be about recalls? And why does it seem like there are more of them than there used to be?
Well, the average consumer should definitely stay on top of recalls, and it can certainly be concerning. I believe the growing number of recalls is multifactorial. There are advances in surveillance and detection of food, as with the CDC's foodborne disease outbreak surveillance system. So, this allows them to have more frequent identification of multi state outbreaks, which leads to recalls. Also, the FDA has implemented some stricter standards. So, for instance, they have the Food Safety Modernization Act, which allows them to have these more regulatory requirements. And as they enforce compliance of these, it leads to more recalls.
Hmm.
Also, the food supply chain. Food is passed through multiple countries, it's passed through multiple facilities, and this just increases the possibility of widespread contamination, thus leading to recalls, and it can make these food safety measures challenging.
So it's not necessarily that all of our food is way more dangerous now than it's ever been. A lot of this really is better regulation and better protections for consumers than there used to be.
Absolutely. There's a lot more awareness of food safety.
That's great. Now, let's say I do accidentally buy food that's been recalled. Let's say it's produce. If I wash it extra well, will that make it safe?
Washing produce does help. So it reduces the bacterial counts on the surface of the food. So it does help prevent foodborne illness. It also actually rinses away metal contaminants that may be present on the surface of produce.
So washing can make a big difference. If I wash it
Yes,
really well, there's a chance that I won't get really sick from it.
absolutely. You should wash your food and wash your produce.
And let's go over some various foods that I grew up being warned about. My mother in particular was extremely worried at all times about mayonnaise. She was so afraid of those mayonnaise salads at picnics in the summer. She didn't want me to eat them if they'd been sitting in the sun. Just how risky is mayonnaise?
So the risk with mayonnaise is because of the eggs. So
Hmm.
there's a bacteria called Staphylococcus aureus that can produce toxins in the mayonnaise if it's been sitting out for too long. So for instance, it can produce toxins under temperatures of 47 degrees Fahrenheit up to 116 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's usually that potato salad or egg salad that's been sitting out on a hot summer day for an extended period of time. It starts to produce those toxins, and then you consume that, and then you can get sick. And then with the eggs, it's more of a concern if unpasteurized eggs were used in the mayonnaise, which fortunately commercial mayonnaise is for the most part pasteurized. But if
Hmm.
unpasteurized eggs are used, then there's a risk of salmonella growing there and releasing its toxins. And that's when you can get sick.
And for listeners who are not in the know, the eggs we're talking about in mayonnaise are not cooked. They are raw eggs that are used in mayonnaise.
Yes, and it's in the raw eggs that the bacteria can grow and produce toxins.
Another something that has raw eggs in it is cookie dough. And cookie dough is another thing my mother warned me against, but all my friends, my husband, they love raw cookie dough and they eat it. And is that just as risky as mayo?
Yes. So with the raw cookie dough, it has raw eggs, but it can also have raw flour.
Oh.
And there was actually
Hmm.
an outbreak in 2009 related to raw prepackaged cookie dough. And so the salmonella I mentioned, so that bacteria can also be found in raw cookie dough. It can definitely lead to foodborne illness. And so, although it tastes yummy, it should be avoided.
Now, we already talked about leftover rice a little bit, but in my case, if the rice has been left over for a few days, I've always been taught just make it into fried rice and it'll be safe again. Does making it into fried rice, does that make it safer?
Not necessarily. And so, I mentioned a particular bacteria called Bacillus cereus that likes to grow or be found in cooked rice.
Hmm.
And so, what happens when that rice is out for too long, it starts to produce those toxins and especially these spores that are heat resistant. And so, even if you heat it, it doesn't necessarily get rid of it. And so, if it's been out for too long, then you should unfortunately just toss it out because there's a possibility that it could have those spores already there that can make you sick.
Oh, my thrifty heart is crying over this. Just throw out food.
I know. And generally, I guess it's more likely to happen if it's really hot. Generally, you're supposed to cook store rice at or below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And so, if it's out in temperatures that are really warm for an extended period of time, that's more likely to occur. But it's better to be safe than sorry.
Hmm.
If you're going to have cooked rice, consume it right away or cool it and then store it right away. And then you can
Hmm.
consume it later.
Okay. So I shouldn't freak out that I'm throwing out perfectly good food because it's not good food. It's not good
It's
food.
not good food.
And then the food that is good, I should store appropriately.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about expired or spoiled food. I confess I have been guilty of, oh no, it looks like there's a tiny spot of mold on this tomato. I'm just going to chop off that section and eat the rest of the tomato. Is that okay for me to do, or is that bad for me too?
So, spoiled or expired food can develop mold, and mold is different. So, mold usually produces mycotoxins, and the effects of that can vary. It could be gastrointestinal symptoms like your nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, but sometimes it can also have other adverse effects, like it can potentially lower immune system. There have been reports of carcinogenic effects from mold, which can lead to cancer. And so, generally speaking, if you see mold, it's best to just discard because despite just removing that moldy piece, there's a possibility that those mycotoxins may have spread.
Now, is there a case where, I've had food around a long time? Like, what if I take that tomato that had the little bit of mold on it and I chop off like that third of the tomato and I make a spaghetti sauce? Can I do that?
Again, not necessarily, because a lot of times once those toxins are in place, sometimes heat doesn't necessarily get rid of it.
Now, what about canned goods? Canned goods are another thing that maybe I keep around a little longer than some other people do. My late mother used to say that that was dangerous. She said I could get botulism from that. Is that true?
Canned foods typically have like an expiration date stamped on them. And so you
Hmm.
always want to look at that first, ensure that the food is not past expiration or close to expiration. When it comes to storing canned food, as long as it's stored right away and cooled right away. So, if, for instance, if you're making something with it and then you're putting that in the refrigerator right away, generally it's safe to use for a couple of more days. Sometimes what can happen over time if you just kind of leave it there, then it can start to form like mold, for instance. And so if you start to notice mold forming, or if you start to notice that it has an odor despite refrigeration, then you want to discard it at that point.
Hmm. Now, something else you mentioned earlier was traveling. When you're assessing a patient who believes they may have food poisoning, you ask if they've traveled. How does that factor into all of this?
So, obviously, here in the United States, we have a lot more stringent standards when it comes to food. In other countries, that may not be so. And especially in other countries, they may eat food, again, from like a roadside vendor. And in those cases, the food can possibly be contaminated. And you're more likely, I guess, to find roadside vendors and things like that, potentially in other countries.
Yeah, I eat a lot of that when I travel.
I know it's hard not to.
Yeah, and confession, I have sometimes had stomach issues afterwards. Okay, so let's change gears and talk about some of the common foodborne illnesses or bacteria that you might hear about in the news, or if you're unlucky, in the doctor's office. And can you just explain what each of them are, starting with norovirus?
Norovirus is the most common cause of foodborne illness. It's very contagious and it doesn't take much of it to get infected. And people are more likely to get it when they're in closed quarters. So, for instance, like cruise ships, a lot of times it's known as the cruise ship virus,
Mm,
schools or nursing homes. And usually it's passed via the fecal oral route, meaning through contaminated food or water, sometimes through person to person contact. So that if you're not washing your hands very well, and then someone handles the food, and then you happen to eat the food that was prepared by someone that wasn't being very safe. Sometimes, if you come in contact with like a surface that's been contaminated with that virus, and fortunately, it lasts only for a couple of days, but usually get you typical symptoms of nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal cramping. There are certain populations that are more vulnerable. So, for instance, infants, the elderly, if someone has a lower immune system, they can get very sick. Dehydration is what we look out for with this because of the vomiting and the diarrhea. So, ensuring that you're keeping hydration is the mainstay of treatment for this.
got it. So you said this is fecal matter that's essentially getting onto surfaces and into food. So if I wash my hands a lot more, am I less likely to get norovirus then?
Yes. So hygiene is extremely important. So hand washing, cleaning, and disinfecting surfaces, very important for
Hmm.
preventing the spread of this.
What about salmonella?
Salmonella is a bacteria that can be found, for instance, in raw eggs, so like your mayonnaise, raw flour. And so that's a bacteria that can also cause foodborne illness. Same symptoms of nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal cramping.
What about E. coli?
E. coli is another one of those bacteria that can be found in poultry, can be found on produce, kind of similarly to salmonella. There are types of E. coli where you can just have more the milder nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal cramps. And then there's the hemorrhagic form, which causes a more severe foodborne illness, fever, abdominal cramping, potentially blood and stool. And if they have any of those symptoms and if they persist for a while, then usually we'll do like stool studies
Hmm.
to look for that particular bacteria.
And is this another case of we just need to wash our hands a lot and wash our food a lot?
With all of it. So with salmonella, even food practices are extremely important and personal hygiene. So washing your hands before you handle your food, rinsing your produce, ensuring that you're cooking food to safe temperatures. When you're in the kitchen, you want to utilize different utensils and cutting boards for uncooked foods versus cooked foods. And then you want to make sure you wash your things thoroughly. So all of those practices will help prevent foodborne illness.
And what about listeria?
So listeria is another bacteria or pathogen, can be found in uncooked eggs, produce, meats, and similarly safe food practices, washing your hands, eating cooked food, rinsing your produce will help prevent that illness.
And technically speaking, is hepatitis A also a foodborne illness?
It can be, yes.
Mm.
And so hepatitis A is transmitted via the fecal oral route. And usually the symptoms can seem pretty severe with a significant abdominal pain, weight loss. It can cause liver inflammation, diarrhea, vomiting. Fortunately, the symptoms tend to resolve after a period of time, but they can get very sick initially.
You may see a lot of recalls in the news, but hearing about more recalls doesn't necessarily mean our food is less safe. It relates to what standards are in place and how well our news outlets or other systems are getting us that information. But having our food pass through more facilities can create more opportunities for contamination. And when it comes to mayo-based salads, raw cookie dough, leftover rice, or those only partially moldy strawberries, when in doubt, don't put it in your mouth. Sadly, we probably shouldn't be eating uncooked eggs or flour, or cutting spoilage off of things and eating the rest. But in general, proper food handling, preparation, and storage are key to A, preventing contaminants from getting into your food, or B, preventing existing bacteria from having the right conditions to create toxins. Now, say that against your best efforts, you still get food poisoning. Let's talk about what to do and extra tips to keep it from happening again. Let's talk about what to do if I eat something, then it gets recalled, or I found out later that it's been sitting in the sun all day. Should I freak out? Is there anything I can do once it's in my stomach? What should I be doing to try and deal with this?
Well, don't freak out. Obviously, once you realize that that food may not have been stored properly or cooked properly or whatever it may be, don't consume any more of that food. If the food's been recalled, then you want to find out why it's been recalled. And then usually you want to let your healthcare provider know. You may not need to be treated right away, but typically at least informing your healthcare provider, I ate this, I don't feel anything right now. So at least in the case symptoms do develop, you would have at least already notified your healthcare provider. And then if symptoms do develop, typically just ensuring you drink plenty of fluids, letting it ride out its course. If it persists for longer than a couple of days, if you develop high fever, significant abdominal pain, blood in your stool, then informing your provider, then at that point, usually we'll have like labs done and stool testing done.
So if it goes on for more than a couple days, then it's time for more interventions from the doctor. What are those interventions?
So usually dehydration tends to be the concern with foodborne illness. So for instance, if you go into the office and if your blood pressure is really low or if your heart rate is very high, then that might be a sign that you might need more fluids. And so typically at that point, you might need IV fluids, for instance, if it's really bad. And then usually we'll also do lab testing, like a blood count, just to see if there's any signs of an infection. We can see that through labs. And then obtaining any stool studies to see if we can pinpoint what exactly the microorganism or pathogen is that's involved. And sometimes antibiotics if warranted.
Got it. In the early hours of realizing that a person has a foodborne illness, is there anything they can do to maybe speed the recovery at home?
Generally, there isn't anything that you can really do to kind of shorten the duration of the symptoms. A lot of it is just more supportive treatment, ensuring you're drinking plenty of fluids, and then kind of waiting it out, unfortunately. Sometimes you can use anti-motility agents or anti-diarrheal agents like loperamide or Imodium. Sometimes that might help with the diarrhea, anti-nausea medications.
And if I do get a foodborne illness from, let's say, a packaged food, is there somewhere I should be reporting it? Am I supposed to call like a hotline and let them know?
Reporting foodborne illness can be helpful, especially if we're trying to prevent outbreaks. And a lot of the reporting will depend on the state in which you live. But typically you can go onto your state's public health department website. And a lot of times they'll have instructions on how you can report a foodborne illness. It is recommended because if we see that someone is getting sick from the same type of product or from the same type of restaurant, for instance, that may point to a potential outbreak and we can intervene sooner rather than later. Healthcare providers typically are also required to report. A lot of times it depends on the type of pathogen involved and if an outbreak is suspected. If lab testing is done, labs are also required to report. But again, it also kind of depends on the type of pathogen involved.
Now, Doctor, you've given us so much great information today about how to prevent foodborne illnesses, wash our hands, keep our surfaces clean, make sure that there is a raw food area and a cooked food area when dealing with things like meats and so on. Are there other things we haven't gotten to yet? For example, should we be peeling versus not peeling our vegetables, or are there other things we should keep in mind?
Peeling is helpful. So peeling does reduce bacterial counts similarly to washing your food.
Now, a term we frequently hear is cross-contamination. What is that and how can we prevent it?
So usually that's more so when you're preparing food. So that's usually when, like for instance, uncooked meat or its juices come in contact with cooked food. We call that cross-contamination. So ways to avoid that are obviously utilizing separate cutting boards, utensils, and knives for when you're handling cooked food versus uncooked food. That helps to prevent cross-contamination, which can increase the risk of foodborne illness.
And finally, we mentioned the recalls that just seem to be ramping up. Are there things we should do as shoppers to be more vigilant?
Absolutely. You should always be paying attention to the food that you're buying. And so you should always look at your food, inspect it, make sure that it looks fresh. It's okay to smell your food, before you buy it to ensure, again, that it smells fresh and that it doesn't have an odor. And then most food will, especially if it's packaged, will have like an expiration date and a packing date. So you want to avoid foods that are past their expiration date or that are close to their expiration date. And then you want to buy foods that are close to their packing date to ensure that they are fresh. And then use your instincts. Again, I think that our instincts will tell us or trigger us if a food is bad or that we shouldn't purchase it.
Oh, wow. Dr. Christine Ragay-Cathers, thank you so much for all your expertise and advice. I will definitely have to be changing some of my behaviors around food after today's conversation, but we so appreciate it.
Well, thank you. My pleasure.
So if you do contract a foodborne illness, try to keep calm, stay hydrated, and notify your healthcare provider. If you're reasonably confident it came from a packaged food or a restaurant, go to your state's public health department website to find out how to report it and do your part to help keep others from getting sick. And when you're at the grocery store, pay attention to your senses. Does the food look fresh? A little vigilance and trusting your instincts go a long way in keeping you happily fed instead of fed up with your food. Okay, that's all for this episode. But if you've got a question or topic suggestion, you can leave us a voicemail at 507-538-6272. We might even feature your voice on the show. On the next episode of Health Matters, understanding the thyroid. In our weight loss obsessed culture, I've heard people joke, I wish that I had metabolism that was out of control and that my thyroid just wouldn't quit. What do you say to people who joke about that?
So it is true that an overactive thyroid, such as Graves' disease, can lead to weight loss. But it leads to a lot of other potential harm, primarily to the heart, to the bones. So when we see patients with Graves' disease, which is an overactive thyroid, we treat them so that they don't develop more serious complications.
For more Health Matters episodes and resources, head to mayoclinic.org/healthmatters. And if you found this show helpful, please subscribe and make sure to rate and review us in your podcast app. It really does help others find the show. Thanks for listening, and until next time, take care and stay healthy. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as medical or legal advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare provider for any medical questions. The appearance of any guest does not imply an endorsement of them, their employer, or any entity they represent. The views and opinions are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of Mayo Clinic. Reference to any product, service, or entity does not constitute an endorsement of or recommendation by Mayo Clinic.
If you're a podcast host, listen up, this one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle, and I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.